Compelling disappearances seem to come in two main flavors. There are those where the circumstances of the disappearance are so strange and seemingly impossible that that alone is compelling. And then there are those where the explanation is more sinister, and that is what makes them compelling. These are the disappearances where the person or people were clearly taken against their will. In this video, we're going to go over two cases of the second variety, or at least sort of. You'll see what I mean. And as always, viewer discretion is advised. In January of 2003, L.S. Quez arrived at her sister's house where a child's birthday festivities were already underway. As kids ran around and played, Lou said her hellos to friends and family and did her best to settle into the party atmosphere. Almost immediately, though, something felt off. L.S. locked eyes with a little girl of about 6 years old across the room and was hit with an overwhelming sense of familiarity. The girl's brown hair and dark brown eyes reminded LSE of her children when they were that age, and she couldn't help but think about the child she lost back in 1997. LSE gave birth to a baby girl named Delimar that year, and just 10 days later, the infant was tragically killed during a house fire that was reportedly started as a result of bad wiring. Sadness washed over LSE as she continued to stare at the little girl across the room who was about the same age as Delimar would have been. Before the moment passed, the little girl flashed LSE a wide smile, showing off her deep, sad dimples. This was the moment that LSE knew with every fiber of her, being that the little girl she was staring at was the exact same little girl that had been claimed by the house sire years earlier. She didn't know how long she stood there watching the girl. It was like time stopped. It may have only been a few seconds, but for her part, the little girl seemed to notice Luce too. She moved in close to her on her own and lingered nearby, even though the two had seemingly never met before. There was no conversation, but the interaction stuck with them long after the moment had passed. The girl appeared comfortable around Luce, as if she recognized her without knowing why. As the party continued, the children eventually went upstairs to color and play. At this moment, Elle saw an opportunity and followed a short distance behind them, trying to stay calm. She knew how unbelievable her thoughts would sound if anyone asked what she was doing, so she did her best to appear natural. For years to that point, she had been told that Delimar died in the fire. Investigators and medical officials had assured her that there was no doubt, but even still, LSE had never really accepted that explanation. When the children started leaving the room they were coloring in, LSE acted. She stopped the girl as she was passing by and told her that there was gum stuck in her hair. The little girl then stood while LSE carefully pulled out a few strands of her hair and put them in a napkin before anyone noticed what she was doing. The moment was brief and LSE returned downstairs, knowing she might be wrong, but also knowing she couldn't ignore what she felt. Taking the girl's hair was the only thing she could think of to find out the truth, and for the first time since the night of the fire, she felt like she finally might have something concrete to bring to the police. Obviously, it was all very risky, and to understand why Luce was willing to take such a risk, it's important to go back to December of 1997 when everything started. Delimar Vera was born on December 5th in 1997 in Philadelphia as the daughter of LSE and Pedro Vera. Her arrival came with the usual exhaustion and adjustment that follows the birth of a newborn. And after a few days in the hospital, LSE brought Delimar home to the family's row house in the Feltonville section of the city. And things only got more lively as those early days of Delimar's life wore on. Her friends and extended family came over regularly, and one of those visitors was Carolyn, a family acquaintance connected to LSE through marriage. Carolyn stopped by on December 15th to meet Delimar and drop off a gift for her parents. During her visit with the couple, Carolyn actually dropped the news that she was expecting too. This was met with the usual excitement and offerings of congratulations, but the joy was short-lived. As LSE and Carolyn talked downstairs, a fire broke out on the second floor where Delimar was fast asleep. Upon realizing this, LSE rushed up the stairs to Delimar's bedroom, and when she reached it, she noticed that the door was closed and the window was open. As she lunged for Delimar's crib, LSE was horrified to see that the infant wasn't there. The crib was completely empty. LSE then desperately searched for the baby as the flames and smoke grew around her. She suffered burns to her face and hands in the effort, but no matter where she looked, she couldn't find Delimar. Conditions got so bad that LSE had to leave the building before her own life was put in jeopardy. Emergency crews responded right away to the call for help and worked to extinguish the fire. As firefighters worked to put out the blaze, members of the local media started showing up, and news footage from that night would show Carolyn comforting Luce outside the home as the scene unfolded. When the fire was finally extinguished and an investigation could begin, Fire experts determined that the blaze had been caused by faulty wiring. And just as LSE learned, investigators found that there was no sign of Delimar in the bedroom she had been sleeping in, or anywhere else for that matter. No recognizable human remains could be found. And based on the conditions of the fire, the medical examiner concluded that the infant had been completely consumed by it. That was the official story anyway, and LSE understandably refused to accept it. From the beginning, LSE believed something else happened that night, and that feeling never really went away. To make things worse, in reality, that feeling was absolutely correct. Delimar did not die in the fire that night in 1997. So let's fast forward back to January of 2003 and the birthday party LSE attended. As soon as she could after getting the sample of hair from the little girl at the party, LSE met with the police to plead her case. She knew she sounded crazy, but it all made too much sense to her that Delimar was alive somewhere, and now she had a way to potentially prove it. Those hairs, however, would never be tested. In order for DNA to be extracted from hair, the strands would need to come from the roots or follicle, and the sample LSE gave them didn't have either. While police were willing to indulge in LSE's story and performing a DNA test, there was little they could do without a proper sample. After digging into LS's claims some more, investigators believed there was some worth in settling the matter once and for all. Unfortunately, though, it wouldn't be until February of the following year when police showed up on the front step of the little girl from the party and her mother to secure a saliva sample from each of them. When the results came back a few days later, though, hardly anyone involved in the case could believe it. The little girl from the party was without a doubt the biological daughter of LSE and Pedro. And the little girl's so-called mother was none other than Carolyn. This meant that Delimar wasn't dead. She had been taken. The how and why of Delimar's kidnapping have never been conclusively answered. But at some point during Caroline's visit to the family on December 15th, she took Delimar and set the fire to the second floor of the row house as cover. Then in the days and weeks after the fire, Carolyn abruptly cut off contact with Len Pedro. Around the same time, she began telling people a different story. She claimed that she had given birth to a baby girl at home on December 12th, just 3 days before the fire. She later obtained a New Jersey birth certificate, listing that date as the birthday of a child named Alia Hernandez. On the night of December 15th, after the fire had already occurred, Caroline called her boyfriend and told him that she had delivered the couple's baby just a few days earlier. As you might imagine, the timing of it all raised a lot of questions among the people who knew her. Some family members were aware that Carolyn had previously undergone a tubulation, which prevents pregnancy at a rate of about 99%. Others noted that she had not appeared pregnant in the months leading up to December. Despite those doubts, though, no one ever really challenged her story. Caroline's claim went largely unquestioned and life simply moved on. After the kidnapping, Caroline took Delimar to Willing, New Jersey, just 6 miles outside of Philadelphia. There, Delimar was raised under the name Alia, believing that Carolyn was her biological mother. For the first 6 years of her life, Delimar had no reason to think otherwise. Carolyn raised Delimar as a single mother alongside 3 much older children Delimar came to know as her siblings. Frustratingly, as she worked long hours at a pharmacy, Caroline was supposedly an absent mother and wasn't the warmest or most caring person to her children. Discipline in Carolyn's house was also supposedly harsh, and when Delimar would act up, Caroline would fetch a belt and use it so hard that she would leave welts and marks on her skin. As Delimar grew older, Carolyn began telling her about a bad woman who wanted to take her away. Carolyn warned that this woman could not be trusted and that she needed to do whatever she could to stay away from her. Delimar didn't know it at the time, but the person being described by Carolyn was her biological mother, LSE. Despite the instability at home, Delimar went to school, made friends, attended playdates and parties, and took part in activities that would indicate a normal upbringing. Caroline even got her involved in some child modeling work. And all of this was going on while Delimar had another family just miles away without her knowledge. She was taken well before she was able to form memories, and she lived a childhood shaped by Carolyn's version of events. She believed Carolyn was her biological mother and accepted the warning she was given about the unnamed woman who might try to take her away. The moment LSE finally spotted Delimar at the party, Caroline's lies began to unravel, although it would take some time before anyone other than LSE and the police would know this. During the investigation after LSE brought the police the strands of the girl's hair, detectives contacted Carolyn in February of 2004 and asked for a photograph of the child known as Alia Hernandez. This was likely the moment that Carolyn realized that the world she had built was being threatened. So when she provided police with a photo, the image was later determined to be that of another child, not Alia. Then, Later that month is when investigators returned to Caroline's house to collect the DNA. As they prepared to take a saliva sample from the little girl, Caroline pulled her aside and sprayed something into her mouth and told her not to swallow it. It was later determined that Caroline had sprayed her own saliva into Delimar's mouth in hopes of sabotaging the test results. This obviously was a desperate ploy that thankfully didn't work, and the results conclusively determined that Aaliyah Hernandez was actually Delimar Vera. With solid and indisputable proof, authorities moved quickly. The child was removed from Caroline's care and returned to her biological family. For Delimar, as you might imagine, the change was sudden and jarring. The woman she believed was her mother was gone, and the people she'd been warned about by Caroline were now telling her the truth about who she was. Caroline was then arrested and charged with arson, kidnapping, and attempted murder. In court, Caroline did not admit guilt, but she didn't fight the charges either. She entered a plea of no contest, meaning she accepted the punishment without formally acknowledging responsibility. So, the case moved forward towards sentencing without a trial. In September of 2005, Caroline was given between 9 and 30 years in prison. Just before the sentence was handed down, she addressed the court and told the judge that she truly believed that Delimar was her biological daughter. Once again, unfortunately, how Caroline executed the kidnapping and why she did it have never been revealed, but several theories have been considered. One suggested that Caroline wanted another child, but couldn't. And she also had a history of falsely claiming she was pregnant, possibly because she liked the attention. Another raised the possibility that having a newborn might influence sentencing in unrelated legal trouble she was facing at the time. Then a third theory alleged that Pedro was in on the kidnapping with Caroline, and that he never believed that Delimar was his biological daughter. However, Pedro denied any role in the crime and was never charged, nor has any evidence ever tied him to the kidnapping. The legal process brought an official end to the case, but it didn't undo the damage Caroline had caused. Delimar had lost 6 years with her biological family, and LSE had spent 6 years being told that her daughter was dead. And unfortunately, reuniting with her biological family didn't bring instant stability for Delimar either. Pedro and LSE had broken up years earlier, so Delimar lived with her mother, who was strict and protective of her. She had already lost her daughter once, and was determined not to let it happen again. By the time Delimar turned 12, she apparently often clashed with LSE, and eventually she moved in with her father, but that relationship also broke down. After a heated argument that turned physical, she entered foster care. For several years after that, Delimar largely raised herself, working odd jobs, and moving between unstable living situations. By 19, she was in an abusive relationship and living in a dangerous neighborhood. But the following year, she decided to leave it all behind. She packed her belongings and moved into her own apartment, which was the spark she needed to turn her life around. Today, Delimar lives quietly in Philadelphia with her husband and stepson. Over the past decade, her relationships with both her parents have improved, and her story was turned into a movie in 2008. And in 2004, a documentary detailing her kidnapping and life afterward was released. In many respects, Sandra or Sandy Horwitz seemed like the perfect mother. She worked 2 jobs, doted on her daughters, and always put their needs and well-being ahead of her own. The family moved from Pennsylvania to Michigan in 1966 because Sandra's husband was pursuing a PhD at the University of Michigan. Their daughters, Tammy, Robin, and Becky, were all within a few years of one another, and looking back, they were among the happiest times in the girls' lives. Their parents were in love, their futures were bright, and they spent lots of time together doing everything from shopping to playing games and watching movies. Everyone knew Sandy adored the girls and loved being their mother. And the family also seemed like the perfect nuclear family. But in 1971, she and her husband called them into the living room for a family meeting that changed their lives forever. When everything was settled, their father told them that he and the mother had grown apart and were getting a divorce. The girls were obviously blindsided by this, but their parents assured them that the new living arrangement wouldn't be so bad once they got used to it. Shortly thereafter, he packed up his belongings and moved to Rochester, Michigan, about 65 miles away. The transition was difficult for Sandy and her daughters, but before long, they all settled into their new routines. The girls stayed with their mother in Ann Arbor during the week and spent most weekends with their father in Rochester. In the fall of 1973, then 33-year-old Sandy had a full-time job as a hospital clerk and another part-time job at a model home in a new development nearby. After work on the evening of Monday, October 1, 1973, Sandy took the girls shopping at a mall. She and the girls stayed at the mall for about an hour and a half and arrived back at the home at approximately 8:30 p.m. About an hour later, Sandy apparently got a call from an unknown male acquaintance. The girl said she and the man had a relatively brief conversation and they were all showered and ready for bed by 10 p.m. Before turning in, 8-year-old Robin asked if she could sleep in her mom's bed. Robin apparently did this on a semi-regular basis, but that night she told her that she'd have to sleep in her own bedroom. After that, the girls all slept soundly, and like always, Robin woke up before her two sisters. At about 6 a.m., she walked down the hall to her mother's bedroom to make sure she was awake too. But when she got there, the bed was empty. Robin assumed she was in the bathroom or in the kitchen making breakfast and packing lunches for her and her sisters. However, after a quick search, Sandy wasn't in the bathroom, the kitchen, or anyone else in the house. At this point, Robin was still a little groggy, but she was becoming increasingly alarmed by her mother's absence. She then looked out the window and saw that her mother's car was exactly where she had parked it the night before. Upon seeing this, she calmly picked up the phone and called the hospital to see if her mother had caught a ride with a coworker and had gone in early. It would have been way out of character for Sandy to leave the girls unattended so early in the morning, but it seemed she was still expecting a rational explanation at this point. The hospital staff hadn't seen her either, though, so next she called her father in Rochester. Her father then assured her that her mother was probably fine and she'd eventually show up. In the meantime, he told her to hang up and called the babysitter down the street. The babysitter showed up a few minutes later, made the girls breakfast, and got them off to school. Then, finally, at approximately 10 a.m., when Sandy still hadn't shown up, she called the Ann Arbor police and reported her missing. It was officially too weird and too alarming. While searching the house, officers discovered that her purse, checkbook, and some of her clothes were missing. There were no signs of a break-in, an assault, or an abduction, like blood, overturned furniture, or damaged doors, windows. But outside, one of the officers noticed that the flower beds at the front of the house were freshly trampled. Of course, Sandy could have disturbed the beds herself while working on the garden, but under the circumstances, it was more than a little suspicious. At the same time, other officers were going door to door to see if any of Sandy's neighbors knew where she was. One woman a few houses down said she heard a loud noise at approximately 10:50 the night she went missing. This was less than an hour after Sandy put the girls to bed. But the woman said she couldn't identify the sound and didn't report it, because it only lasts a few seconds. Meanwhile, a state police helicopter joined the search, and Sandy's increasingly distraught friends and family members called everyone they could think of. But neither Sandy nor any clue of her whereabouts was ever found. The girl's father then came to live with them shortly after Sandy disappeared. As stressful and heartbreaking as the situation was, he made them go to school every day because he didn't want them sitting around the house and worrying themselves sick about something they had absolutely no control over. The girls held out hope that their mother's disappearance was all just a big misunderstanding, and that it was only a matter of time before she showed up, and that things would eventually go back to way before. But sadly, that just wasn't the case. In the evenings, the girls often heard their father talking to friends and relatives who stopped by to make sure they were all okay. Sometimes during these conversations, the adults used words like kidnapped and abducted when they thought the girls had a earshot. They weren't exactly sure what they meant, but considering what was going on, they figured out that their mother was probably taken against her will, and that the situation was getting more dire with each passing day. In the weeks that followed, a number of acquaintances were questioned and polygraphed by investigators, but none of the tests revealed any signs of deception, and Sandy's ex-husband and the other persons of interest were ultimately cleared of any involvement. Weeks then turned into months, and the girls were eventually forced to move back to Rochester with their father. Under the circumstances, all they could really do was quietly move on. And apparently they were doing about as well as could be expected. They always held out hope that the case would be solved, but by the 2-year mark, they knew this wasn't very likely. Then something strange happened. That spring of 1975, investigators got an interesting call from a detective in Royal Oak, Michigan, just a few minutes north of downtown Detroit. To make a long story short, the detective would go on to say that a man named Gary Addison Taylor might have abducted and killed Sandy in October when she went missing. By 1970, Gary Addison Taylor had a well-documented history of attacking, kidnapping, and assaulting women in Michigan, Florida, Texas, and Washington dating back to the 1940s. While living in Detroit, he actually regularly shot at women, waiting at bus stops, in and around Royal Oak. This earned him the nickname the Royal Oak Sniper, long before he was even a suspect. Gary had also been in and out of psychiatric hospitals in multiple states, and was suspected of a kidnapping in Seattle, Washington. However, he was acquitted of most of the crimes committed in Michigan because courts repeatedly determined he was legally insane. According to Michigan law, defendants acquitted of crimes by reason of insanity can be institutionalized, but not indefinitely. Instead, they have to have regular assessments to determine if they're still a threat to themselves or the community. If not, they're usually released, After getting the tip, Ann Arbor detectives actually discovered that Gary lived near Sandy and her kids at the time of her disappearance. And more alarmingly, records indicated that he stopped attending outpatient sessions with his therapist and left the state at about the same time. Luckily, Gary was apprehended in Texas in early 1918, and considering the pending charges against him, it didn't look like he'd be getting out of custody anytime soon. Then shortly thereafter, he told his attorney about a number of kidnappings and murders he allegedly committed in various states, including Michigan. His attorney then called the Michigan State Police and told them that he confessed to murdering 3 women and 1 man and burying them in the backyard of his former home. This prompted them to wonder if Sandy was one of his victims. They were then going to ask Gary if she was, and he admitted to knowing her but said he had nothing to do with her disappearance. It's not really clear how they knew one another, but some sources claimed that they met at the model home where she worked. Whatever the case, within days, officers and cadaver dog searched the property and found the bodies of 2 females buried in the backyard. However, unfortunately, neither one of them was Sandy Horwitz. Sort of suspiciously, though, the 3rd female and the male that Gary allegedly killed and buried were never found. Gary was eventually extradited to Washington State, convicted of murder, and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Unfortunately, the authorities were never able to link him to Sandy's death or any of the other 20 murders he was suspected of committing, or even if the number was really that high. In the early years, Sandy's girls only knew what their father and grandparents told them about their mother's disappearance. And truth be told, it wasn't very much, but as young adults, they took more active roles when the police finally gave them access to the case file in the mid-90s. The experience was heartbreaking, to say the least. With such little evidence, all they could do was draw their own conclusions and hope that somebody would eventually come forward with a tip that would blow the case wide open. With that said, though, with what was out there, apparently Robin and her sisters always maintained that Gary was involved in their mother's disappearance, and they weren't alone in thinking that. State and local investigators and FBI profilers all agreed that he was by far the strongest suspect. In Toivern-Draudval, investigators reached out to Gary at the Washington State Penitentiary to see if he'd meet with them and discuss Zwei's case. Robin and her sisters knew it might be their last chance to get any kind of closure, but they hoped that he would finally come clean, if only because he had nothing left to lose. Gary, however, told the investigators that he wasn't interested in meeting with them or making any confessions. So, in the end, Sandy put her daughters to bed one evening in October of 1973. A little while later, a neighbor apparently heard a loud noise, and that was it. After that, Sandy was never seen again. Her daughter walked around her house the next morning looking for Mother, only for the last time she had ever seen her to be the night before. Other than Sandy herself, her checkbook, purse, and a few other pieces of clothing were missing. Some people have speculated that she left on her own, while others point to a more sinister connection to a known predator who happened to be in the area at the time of her disappearance. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching, and a special thanks to everyone who supports the channel on Patreon or as a channel member. If you're interested, we offer early access videos that are released roughly a week before the regular YouTube uploads. Also, if you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it using the form found in the description. Anyways, thanks again, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.